नमस्कार, राज्यसभा टीवी के खास कार्यक्रम संसदीय वाद विवाद में आपका स्वागत है। मैं हूं अरविंद कुमार सिंह। इस एपिसोड में हम दिखाने जा रहे हैं आपको एक बेहद खास बहस जो कि हुई ब्रिटिश की संसद हाउस ऑफ कॉमन्स में। हाउस ऑफ कॉमन्स में सरकारी पक्ष ने एक अहम प्रस्ताव रखा सीरिया पर सैन्य हस्तक्षेप को लेकर, लेकिन सरकार का यह प्रस्ताव 13 वोटों से गिर गया। लेकिन यह कुल मिलाकर चर्चा बेहद शानदार रही। आइए आपको दिखाते हैं वाद विवाद का यह अंश।
We now come to the motion in the name of the Prime Minister relating to Syria and the use of chemical weapons. To move the motion, I call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank you, Mr. Speaker, for agreeing to our request to recall the House of Commons for this important debate. The question before the House today is how to respond to one of the most abhorrent uses of chemical weapons in a century, slaughtering innocent men, women and children in Syria. It is not about taking sides in the Syrian conflict. It is not about invading. It is not about regime change or even working more closely with the opposition. It is about the large-scale use of chemical weapons and our response to a war crime, nothing else. In reaching our conclusions, let me set out what the House has in front of it today. We have a summary of the government's legal position, making explicit that military action would have a clear legal basis. We have the key independent judgments of the Joint Intelligence Committee, making clear their view of what happened and who is responsible. And we have a motion from the government that sets out a very careful path of steps that need to be taken before Britain could participate in any direct military action. These include the weapons inspectors reporting, further action at the United Nations, and another vote in this House of Commons. And the motion also makes clear that even if all these steps are taken, anything we do would have to be legal, proportionate, and specifically focused on deterring and preventing further use of chemical weapons. We are not invading a country. We're not searching for chemical or biological weapons. The case for ultimately supporting action is not based on a specific piece or pieces of intelligence. The fact the Syrian government has and has used chemical weapons is beyond doubt. The fact that the most recent attack took place is not seriously doubted. The Syrian government has said it took place. Even the Iranian president said that it took place. And the evidence that the Syrian regime has used these weapons in the early hours of the 21st of August is right in front of our eyes. We have multiple eyewitness accounts of chemical-filled rockets being used against opposition-controlled areas. We have thousands of social media reports and at least 95 different videos, horrific videos, documenting the evidence. Now Europe is united in the view that we should not let this chemical weapons use stand. Today, NATO has made a very clear statement that those who are responsible should be held accountable. The Arab League issued a statement holding the Syrian regime fully responsible and asking the international community to overcome internal disagreements and to take action against those who committed this crime. I think it is right on these vital issues of national and international importance to seek the greatest possible consensus. When I spoke to President Obama last weekend, I said we shared his view about the despicable nature of this use of chemical weapons and that we must not stand aside. I also explained to him that because of the damage done to public confidence by Iraq, we would have to follow a series of incremental steps, including at the United Nations, to build public confidence and ensure the maximum possible legitimacy for any action. These steps are all set out in the motion before the House today.
I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. Has the Prime Minister made it clear to President Obama that in no way does this country support any attack that could come before the UN inspectors have done their job?
It is this House that will decide what steps we next take. If you agree to the motion I've set down, no action can be taken until we have heard from the UN weapons inspectors, until there's been further action at the United Nations and another vote in this House. Those are the conditions that we, the British government, the British Parliament, are setting.
In welcoming his decision to go through the UN process, could he confirm to the House that were we to find during that process overwhelming opposition in the General Assembly and a majority against it in the Security Council, as occurred 10 years ago, we wouldn't then just motor on?
No, I think it would be unthinkable to proceed if there was overwhelming opposition in the Security Council. Look, the very best route to follow is to have a Chapter 7 resolution, take it to the UN Security Council, have it passed, and then think about taking action. That is the path we followed with Libya. It cannot be the case that that is the only way to have a legal basis for action. And we should consider for a moment what the consequences would be if that were the case. You could have a situation in a country where its government was literally annihilating half the people in that country. But because of one veto on the Security Council, you would be hampered from taking any action. Now, I can't think of any member in any party of this House who'd want to sign up to that. And that's why it's important. We do have the doctrine of humanitarian intervention, which is set out in the Attorney General's excellent legal advice to this House.
I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend. Can I ask him, why is it that our allies in the Middle East, like Saudi, Emirates, Qatar, Kuwait and others, cannot take military action? Why does it fall on us yet again?
Let's be clear, no decision about military action has been taken. It would require another vote of this House. But if we wanted to see action that was purely about deterring and degrading future chemical weapons use by Syria, and that is the only basis on which I would support any action, then you need countries that have the capabilities to do that, of which the United States and the United Kingdom are two, and there are very few other countries that will be able to do that. Right honourable gentleman.
The issues of Iraq and the impact they have on the decisions of today. But the perception, the justifiable perception, in my opinion, of his own preparedness to get involved in this conflict long before the current incident surely has an impact on the decisions of today.
What I would say to the right honourable gentleman is the case I'm making is that the House of Commons needs to consider purely and simply this issue of a massive chemical weapons use by this regime. I'm not arguing we should get more involved in this conflict. I'm not arguing we should arm the rebels. I'm not making any of those arguments. The question before us as a government, as a House of Commons, as a world, is there is this 1925 agreement, post the First World War, these weapons are morally reprehensible, and do we want to try to maintain that law? Put simply, is it in Britain's national interest to maintain an international taboo about the use of chemical weapons on the battlefield? My argument is yes, it is. Britain was part of drawing up that vital protocol, a protocol which, incidentally, Syria itself signed, and I think we have an interest in maintaining it. Let me take an intervention from the Democratic Unionist Party.
Could you explain to us that if, as the briefing says today, there have already been 14 instances of use of chemical weapons, 100,000 people dead, 1.2 million people displaced, why is it only now that the Prime Minister thinks this is the time for greater intervention?
I think the point for considering this tougher approach is that we know there are the 14 uses of chemical weapons on a smaller scale, at least 14, and now we have this much larger use. And this does seem to me, and to President Obama, and to President Hollande, and to many others, an appropriate moment to ask whether it is time to do something to stand up for the prohibition against the use of chemical weapons. You can't, on the one hand, accuse me of rushing into something, but on the other hand, say, why have you waited for 14 chemical weapons attacks before you do something? Let me set out what we know about what happened. Médecins Sans Frontières reported that in just 3 hours on the morning of the 21st of August, 3 hospitals in the Damascus area received approximately 3,600 patients with symptoms consistent with chemical weapons attacks. At least 350 of those innocent people died. The video footage illustrates some of the most sickening human suffering imaginable. And expert video analysis can find no way that this wide array of footage could have been fabricated, particularly the behaviour of small children in those shocking videos. There are pictures of bodies with symptoms consistent with that of nerve agent exposure, including muscle spasms and foaming at the nose and mouth. The Syrian regime has publicly admitted they were conducting a major military operation in the area at that time. The regime resisted calls for immediate and unrestricted access for UN inspectors, while artillery and rocket fire in the area reached a level around 4 times higher than the preceding 10 days. And there is intelligence that Syrian regime forces took precautions normally associated with chemical weapons use. Now, examining all this evidence, together with the available intelligence, the Joint Intelligence Committee has made its judgments. We're today publishing these key judgments in a letter from the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. The letter states there is little serious dispute that chemical attacks causing mass casualties on a larger scale than hitherto took place on the 21st of August. On the Syrian opposition, the letter states there is no credible intelligence or other evidence to substantiate the claims or the possession of chemical weapons by the opposition. The Joint Intelligence Committee therefore concludes it is not possible for the opposition to have carried out a chemical weapons attack on this scale. And it says this, and I quote, "The regime has used chemical weapons on a smaller scale on at least 14 occasions in the past. There is some intelligence to suggest regime culpability in this attack, and these factors make it highly likely that the Syrian regime was responsible." I am saying this is a judgment. We all have to reach a judgment about what happened and who was responsible. But I would put it to you that from all the evidence we have, the fact that opposition don't have chemical weapons, the fact the regime do, the fact they've used it, the fact they were attacking the area at the time, and that intelligence I've reported, that is enough to conclude that the regime is responsible and should be held accountable. Let me take the right honourable lady and then the honourable gentleman.
What has convinced him? Where is the evidence that an action by the international community would cease the use of chemical weapons within Syria, a country where the combatants have accepted 100,000 dead, millions of refugees, and a continuing action which is destroying totally that country? Where is the evidence that convinces him that the external world can prevent this?
As I've just said, in the end, there is no 100% certainty about who is responsible. You have to make a judgment. There is also no 100% certainty about what path of action might succeed or fail. But let me say this to the honourable lady. I think we can be as certain as possible that when we have a regime that has used chemical weapons on 14 occasions, that is most likely responsible for this large-scale attack, that if nothing is done, it will conclude that it can use these weapons again and again and on a larger scale and with impunity. I give way to the honourable gentleman.
Could he explain to the House why he thinks that President Assad did this? There seems to be no logic for this chemical attack, and that is what's worrying some people.
If he reads the JIC conclusions, this is where they find the greatest difficulty of ascribing motives. I think the most likely possibility is that he has been testing the boundaries. 14 uses and no response, at least 14 uses, and he wants to know whether the world will respond to the use of these weapons, which actually I suspect tragically and repulsively are proving quite effective on the battlefield. But in the end, we can't know the mind of this brutal dictator. All we can do is make a judgment about whether it is better to act or not to act, and whether to make a judgment about whether he's responsible or not responsible. In the end, these are all issues of judgment, and as members of Parliament, we will have to make them.
I agree with the Prime Minister about the horror of chemical weapons, but the vast majority of 100,000 killed so far in this civil war in Syria have been as a result of conventional weapons. Can he convince the House that military action by our country would shorten the civil war and help to herald in a post-war government that could create stability?
Great, it's a good question. I can't make any of those assurances. Obviously, we have not made that decision. But were we to make a decision to join the Americans and others in military action, it would have to be action, in my view, that was solely about deterring and degrading the future use of chemical weapons by the Syrian regime. Honourable gentleman.
Does he agree with me that whoever is responsible for chemical weapons attacks should know that they will face a court, whether that is the International Criminal Court or a specially convened war crimes tribunal in the future? Because whether there is military intervention or not, somebody is responsible for a heinous crime. They should face the law.
I certainly agree that people should be subject to the International Criminal Court, and of course possession and use of chemical weapons is a crime and can be prosecuted. But we have to recognise the slowness of those wheels and the fact that Syria is not even a signatory to that treaty. Let me take the next question of whether we would be in danger of undermining our ambitions for a political solution in Syria. Now, there's not some choice between, on the one hand, acting to prevent chemical weapons being used against the Syrian people, and on the other, continuing to push for a long-term political solution. We need to do both. We remain absolutely committed to using diplomacy to end this war with a political solution.
हाउस ऑफ कॉमन्स में सीरिया मसले पर हुई चर्चा के कई कोण रहे। सांसदों का मानना था कि सीरिया में हुआ रासायनिक हमला बेहद गंभीर है, लेकिन कई लोगों का यह भी मानना था कि जब तक कोई पुख्ता सबूत नहीं मिलते, सीरिया के खिलाफ किसी तरह की कार्रवाई के बारे में सोचना भी ठीक नहीं है। फिलहाल लेते हैं एक छोटा सा ब्रेक, और ब्रेक के बाद आपको दिखाएंगे वाद विवाद।
We must let the UN weapons inspectors do their work and let them report to the Security Council. So the weapons inspectors are in the midst of their work and will be reporting in the coming days. That is why today could not have been the day when the House was asked to decide on military actions. For this House, it is surely a basic point. Evidence should precede decision, not decision precede evidence. And I am glad that on reflection the Prime Minister accepted this yesterday.
ब्रेक के बाद आपका स्वागत है। आप देख रहे हैं हमारा खास कार्यक्रम संसदीय वाद विवाद। मैं हूं अरविंद कुमार सिंह। सीरिया के मसले को लेकर ब्रिटिश संसद में हुई चर्चा कई मायनों में अनूठी रही। सांसदों का कहना था कि रासायनिक हथियार गिराना एक गंभीर युद्ध अपराध है और इसको लेकर के किसी भी तरह से किसी को भी माफ़ नहीं किया जाना चाहिए।
Can I thank the Prime Minister for giving way? Has he looked at the consequences of what might happen with an intervention and the effects that it will have on the stability of a country like Yemen?
The fact is the region has already been profoundly endangered by the conflict in Syria. You've got Lebanon facing sectarian tensions as refugees pile across the border. Jordan is coping with a massive influx of refugees. Our NATO ally Turkey has suffered terrorist attacks and shelling from across the border. But standing by as a new chemical weapons threat emerges in Syria is not going to alleviate those challenges, it's going to deepen them. And that's why the Arab League have been so clear in condemning the action, in attributing it precisely to President Assad, and in calling for international action. This is a major difference. I give way to my honourable friend.
The Prime Minister, will he assure us that he will continue to engage, however difficult, with Russia and the other key countries to try to make sure that the UN route is productive and that the diplomatic process is engaged again as soon as possible?
I absolutely agree with my right honourable friend that we must continue the process of diplomatic engagement. Even after I'd spoken to President Obama before the weekend, I called President Putin on Monday and had a long discussion with him about this issue. Now, we are a long way apart, but the one issue we do agree about is the need to get the Geneva II process going. So the assurance I can give him is that if there was any action, it would be immediately taken over by running a political process once again, and that Britain will do everything in its power to help make that happen. Let me answer a final question that has been put in the debate over recent days, and that is the question of whether this will risk radicalising more young Muslims, including people here in Britain. So this question was asked at the National Security Council yesterday, and we've received considered analysis from our counter-terrorism experts. Their assessment is that while as ever there is no room for complacency, the legal, proportionate and focused actions that would be proposed will not be a significant new cause of radicalisation and extremism. And I would make this point. Young Muslims in the region and here in Britain are looking at the pictures of Muslims suffering in Syria, seeing the most horrific deaths from chemical weapons. Many of them may be asking whether the world is going to step up and respond. And I believe the right message to give them is that we should.
The question is the motion on Syria and the use of chemical weapons as published in corrected form. To move his amendment, I call the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to move the amendment, standing in the name of myself and my right honourable friends. And I start by joining the Prime Minister in expressing revulsion at the killing of hundreds of innocent civilians in Ghouta on the 21st of August. This was a moral outrage, and the international community is right to condemn it. As the Prime Minister said, everyone in this House and most people in the country will have seen the pictures of men, women and children gasping for breath and dying as a result of this heinous attack. I can assure members of this House that the divide that exists does not exist over the condemnation of the use of chemical weapons and the fact that it breaches international law, nor does it lie in the willingness to condemn the regime of President Assad. The question facing this House is what, if any, military action we should take and what criteria should determine that decision. For me, that does not rule out military intervention. I want to be clear about this. But I don't think anybody in this House or anybody in the country should be under any illusions about the effect of our relationship to the conflict in Syria if we were to militarily intervene. And in our minds should be this simple question, which is upholding international law and legitimacy. How can we make the lives of the Syrian people better? And we should also have in our minds, and it's right to remember it on this occasion, the duty we owe to the exceptional men and women of our armed forces and their families who will face the direct consequences of any decision that we make. Now, Mr. Speaker, the basis on which we make this decision is of fundamental importance, because the basis of making the decision determines the legitimacy and moral authority of any action that we undertake. That's why our amendment asks the House to support a clear and legitimate roadmap to decision on this issue. If we follow this roadmap, it can assure the country and the international community that if we take action, we will have followed the right, legitimate and legal course. And I think that is very, very important to any decision that we make. Let me turn to the conditions in our motion. First, we must let the UN weapons inspectors do their work and let them report to the Security Council. So the weapons inspectors are in the midst of their work and will be reporting in the coming days. That is why today could not have been the day when the House was asked to decide on military action. For this House, it is surely a basic point. Evidence should precede decision, not decision precede evidence. And I'm glad that on reflection the Prime Minister accepted this yesterday. The second step, Mr. Speaker, in our roadmap makes clear there needs to be compelling evidence that the Syrian regime was responsible for the attacks. I welcome the letter from the chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee today, and I note the Arab League's view of President Assad's culpability. Of course, as the Prime Minister said, in conflict there is always reason for doubt, but the greater the weight of evidence, the better. On Tuesday we were promised there will be the release of American intelligence that there was proof of the regime culpability. We await the publication of that evidence, which will be later today, but that evidence too will be important in building up the body of evidence that President Assad was responsible. The third step, Mr. Speaker, is that in light of the weapons inspector's findings and this other evidence, and as the Secretary-General said, the UN Security Council should then debate what action should be taken, and indeed should vote on action. The UN is not some inconvenient sideshow, and we don't want to engineer a moment. Instead, we want to adhere to the principles of international law. Now let me just say on the question of the Security Council, Mr. Speaker, I'm also clear it is incumbent on us to try to build the widest level of support among the 15 members of the Security Council, whatever the intentions of particular countries. The level of international support is vital should we decide to take military action. It is vital in the eyes of the world. That's why it can't be seen as some sideshow or some moment, but actually an essential part of building the case if intervention takes place.
I think, and he's right, the UN Security Council should not be just a slideshow. But why does his motion merely say that the Security Council should have voted on the matter, rather than it should have voted in favour of some intervention?
I'll come directly to that question, because there will be those who argue that in the event of Russia and China vetoing a Security Council resolution, that any military action would necessarily not be legitimate. I understand that view, but I don't agree with it. Because I believe that if there is a proper case made, then there is scope in international law, our fourth condition, for action to be taken even without a Chapter 7 Security Council resolution. But, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister didn't go in much detail of the Attorney General's legal advice. Because it's worth noting that in the Attorney General's legal advice there are three very important conditions. Convincing evidence, generally accepted by the international community as a whole, of extreme humanitarian distress. Second, objectively clear there is no practical alternative to the use of force if lives are to be saved. That is a testing condition which we need to test out in the coming days and the coming period. And third, the proposed use of force must be proportionate and strictly limited in time. So the attorney concludes in his advice, it's very, very important for the House to understand this, that there could be circumstances in the absence of a Chapter 7 Security Council resolution for action to be taken, but subject to those three conditions. This takes me, Mr. Speaker, to the final point of the roadmap we propose. Any military action must be specifically designed to deter the future use of chemical weapons. It must be time-limited with specific purpose and scope, so that future action would require further recourse to this House. And it must have regard to the consequences of any action. Now Mr. Speaker, we must ensure that every effort is made to bring the civil war in Syria to an end, and the principal responsibility for that, of course, rests with the parties in that conflict, and in particular President Assad. But the international community also has a duty to do everything it can to support the Geneva II process, and any action, and this is the key point, we take must assist this process and not hinder it. And that is the responsibility that lies on the government in the coming period, the government and its allies, to set out that case. And by setting the framework today, we give ourselves the time and space to actually scrutinise what is being proposed by the government to see what the implications are.
Just for the sake of clarity, for the House, can the Right Honourable gentleman tell us, if there was no UN security resolution, would the Labour opposition back military intervention?
If people are asking me today to say, yes, now let us take military action, I'm not going to say that. But nor am I going to rule out military action, because we have to do so on the basis of evidence and the basis of the consensus and the support that can be built. Our amendment sets out a roadmap from evidence to decision that I believe can command the confidence of the House and the British public. And crucially, and this is an important point, it places responsibility for the judgment about the achievement of the criteria for action, reporting by the weapons inspectors, compelling evidence, the vote in the Security Council, the legal base, and the prospect of successful action with this House in a subsequent vote.
The Honourable Gentleman speaks of a roadmap. Does he not appreciate that the first stage in our response to these atrocities is what we do in this chamber this afternoon? Given that his perfectly legitimate concerns about consequences, evidence, etc. have been met by the government motion, could I urge him to support the motion so we can send a united, strong message to Assad and others? Otherwise, we will be undermining our own national security.
Mr. Speaker, we're not going to be supporting a government motion which was briefed this morning at setting out an in-principle decision to take military action. That would be the wrong thing to do. We could only support military action and should only make the decision to do so when the conditions of our amendment are met. But this, Mr. Speaker, is a very grave decision, and it should be treated as such by this House, and it will be treated as such by this country. In the end, the fundamental test will be this. As we think about the men, women and children who have been subjected to this atrocity, and we think about the prospects for other citizens in Syria, can the international community act in a lawful and legitimate way that will help them and prevent further suffering? The seriousness of our deliberations should match the significance of the decision we face. That is why I urge the House to support our amendment today.
सीरिया में अगस्त महीने में जिस तरह से रासायनिक हथियार गिराए गए, उसे लेकर विश्व मानवता का चिंतित होना स्वाभाविक है। लेकिन क्या इसकी आड़ में दुनिया के कुछ देशों को सीरिया पर हमला करने की इजाज़त दी जानी चाहिए या फिर उसे तबाह करने की इजाज़त दी जानी चाहिए? इस एपिसोड में फ़िलहाल यहीं तक। आगे मिलेंगे किसी और ख़ास एपिसोड के साथ। तब तक के लिए धन्यवाद।